First of all, welcome everyone to this first episode, China, the Art of Law. My name is Jeroen. I work at the Shanghai office for Mark's team. And I've been in China for around 2 years now. In the grand scheme of things, not as long as Mark has been. But as I'm wandering around the office, I've seen this book laying around that some people may have seen. It's this book, the China, the Art of Law. And I picked it up, decided to read it. And I was wondering to myself, how would the author of this book, the Mark Schaub, the one and only, how would he write this book in 2020? So we thought it would be a great idea to kick off a webinar series where we go over the book chapter by chapter, and we ask Mark a few questions about the book and how he sees things in 2020. So the book was written in 2005. That's 15 years ago. So I want to set the tone and ask Mark a few questions. Who was the president of China in 2005?
Hu Jintao.
That's correct. Who was the prime minister of the UK?
David Cameron?
Tony Blair.
Okay. Oh, must have been just...
It was the last time that Lance Armstrong won the Tour de France. So.
Okay.
It was a competitive year because in this year, Mark had to compete with the 6th Harry Potter book, another bestseller. So in this first episode, we plan to cover a little bit of the general topics surrounding China, how it has changed over the years. Then we dive in a little bit about contracts in China, the do's and don'ts, and Guangxi, something that Mark knows all about. And we want to encourage everyone to ask questions. Please put them in the chat box down below or up there, wherever it is. And we'll try to include some of them. But the first question I want to ask, back in 2005, Mark, you were the first foreign lawyer in China. Back during 2005, what made you decide to write this book?
Well, firstly, the book was written in 2005. I lived in Shanghai from 1993. So I'd been in China for quite a while before I wrote the book. Why did I write the book? To tell you the truth, CCH had read some of my articles and they approached me, do you want to write a book? And I said, okay, I'll write a book. So that was the reason. And I tried to write it in a way that was a little bit more conversational, and perhaps most books by lawyers tend to be very technical and very dry. And I tried to put in case studies and try to make it a bit more lively than the average book written by a lawyer. Yeah.
So what's the first thing that comes to mind if I ask you how has China or Shanghai changed in the last 15 years?
Yeah, again, I think, the better reference point for me would be 1993. So I can see there's a photo from 2005 with the Jin Mao, the exhibition center, but back in 1993, it was even a much bigger change. Pudong was hardly there. I think in 2005, there was still a shipyard in Pudong. So I think in the last 15 years, since the book was written, I think China improved. I'd be guessing the heyday of China's growth would have been probably 2000 to 2010. And, Shanghai, I think in particular, nobody could keep up that level of development. And so I guess, in the last 15 years, it's been until this year, which has been a bit of a challenging year for a number of reasons. But I think, it's surprised everybody how China has continued to improve economically, how the legal system has become more complex. But, there's still, a lot of what's in the book, I think, still applies equally today.
Yeah. Just to quote something from the book, from the very beginning, as you mentioned, the legal system, you say, quote, that the authorities have borrowed many principles and ideas from overseas and they have adapted them to the Chinese situation. Would you say that still stands true nowadays?
I think I wouldn't probably write it in that way anymore. I think in the last 10 years or so, what I think you've noticed is China still kind of borrows concepts. When I would have written that, it was more a reflection on certain laws like the IP laws. They borrowed certain concepts, or antitrust laws, they borrowed concepts. I think China still does that a bit, But perhaps what, they haven't really gone down as much as I would have perhaps expected back then, is they still retain within the authorities great discretion. So I think, I think it's much better if we talk about not so much the laws, but, the rule of law, the position of judges, etc. I think that's all improved a lot, especially in first-tier cities. But I think, the thing which is still sometimes difficult is, I don't think people would say that there's a level playing field for foreign companies. And secondly, the role of the government in business and in the law is much different to in the West. Although with Trump and TikTok, I don't know, maybe it's the same in America, or maybe they're borrowing China's system. But I think, really, when you look at it, there is still an awful lot of discretion in the hands of the authorities.
And if you take a look, for example, at the Foreign Investment Guidance Catalog, you mentioned it in the book as well. What are your thoughts about that? That has definitely changed over the years. Do you see that China is taking more initiative with regards to that compared to the rest of the world, or are they following the trend?
Well, I think China is a bit of an outlier. I think China was always, I would argue, even though it's not a level playing field, it's a quite international playing field for foreign companies. So I think, if you look at China, all the foreign players are there, so they are competing. So I don't know if it was really market access. Obviously, things like telco, media, financial services, but that's changing. So perhaps the best example is back in 2005, it was still very clear that in the auto industry, you had to have a 50-50 joint venture partner if you're going to manufacture cars. But as China became more confident, these regulations have been, stripped away. So I think, it has had a trend of overall liberalization, but there are still issues in level playing field on procurement and other issues. And we've moved from what was a prescriptive guidance catalog, which was hundreds of pages long in the past, which was, things like diesel engines, for example, you had to have a certain type of joint venture, a certain type of partner. But nowadays, it's moved to a negative list, which just basically says these kind of companies have restrictions. Unfortunately, for many foreign companies, they do tend to be some of the hottest sectors in the Chinese economy. So I think that's something which I think there's a liberalizing trend, but competition's improved as well. So it's not, the Chinese companies are no longer a pushover. I think you see it also, let's say in the banks, Western companies can now more easily invest in Chinese banks, but probably Chinese banks don't need to learn that much from the West anymore. So they probably don't really need foreign banks' investment or technology. They feel pretty confident by themselves.
Yeah. And just to add to that, you think that will be a continuous trend, or do you think things will shift?
Oh, look, I think, everybody must be a bit concerned about what's happening, that China might feel that it's being cut off from other countries, but I don't think that's the case. And I think, maybe somebody can cut themselves off from China, but China's been perhaps the greatest beneficiary of globalization. And so I don't think that they really want to be cut off. I think they will have to perhaps try and create indigenous technology if they're being cut off from specific technologies. But I think China firstly has a great interest in foreign technology. It's a large importer of foreign technology, something that you might not say about the United States, for example. But also, back in 2005, most of our clients were investing in China to make things for a B2B world. But I think nowadays, most companies who are setting up in China are really targeting the Chinese market. There's still a few who are doing the B2B, but China is such a crucial market. It probably for the last 5 years, I would be guessing, is responsible for half of global GDP growth. Not half of the GDP, but it's one of the few places which has growth. And so I think, for many foreign companies, they will want to come. And I think China will want to welcome foreign companies setting up because they also like to keep their foreign exchange reserves high. So I don't think it's going to change. I think they'll continue to liberalize and open up.
So you think it's also fair to say that compared to back then, when you take a look at the foreign investment guidance catalog, that nowadays there are more opportunities because they just have a small negative list. And on top of that, there's a more fleshed out legal framework that companies can operate within.
Well, I don't know about that. I think, look, the foreign investment catalog, it was rare that you'd come across something that was off limits. It's, even though it was a long document, most stuff wasn't really off limits. And I think back in 2005, China, it was very, very keen on foreign investment. So, local governments there, they would pick you up from the airport, probably throw a parade, have big banners saying, welcome, Mr. Schmidt from Germany, please invest in Kunshan or, wherever. I think, there's been much more self-confidence. So unless you've got a very, very, very big project, like a Tesla-sized project in Shanghai, I think it's become more normal. It's like, well, if you fit the regulations, you're very welcome to come. But if not, no. And then I guess if you go into third tier cities or fourth tier cities, they probably still get that banner out. So I don't think the regulations by themselves were holding people back. I think it's just perhaps, it just shows China is perhaps on a little bit less of a controlling pathway, moving to a negative list. It's been in the pipeline for a while, and it was introduced into the Pudong new area beforehand. And so, so, liberalization, but a more mature country, so is less, fighting over foreigners or getting excited.
Yeah, something that hasn't changed in the heydays compared to now is that you need to have a contract, especially back then, but you still need it now. So that kind of takes us in the next section of your book that it naturally flows into. And let me just quote something from the book that it stood out to you that as you went to a hotel, there was a small guest book in the corner of the room. And in that guest book, it said that raising poultry and livestock is forbidden in your room. Oh, that's always good to know. And I mean, Mark might have not known that back then, but it was quite detailed. And you say that contracts, they must be very detailed because you can't assume things. And that was you wrote this back in 2005. How was it back then compared to now?
Well, I think you didn't read the whole quote. I don't have the book with me here, but the whole quote also involved that you weren't allowed to engage in prostitution, gambling, fighting, or nuclear materials or something.
Radioactive
so it was quite an extensive list. But I think, the issue was that things had to be spelled out. And what I remember with the hotel, actually, there was another hotel and it had a sign next to the lampshade saying, do not hang your wet clothing on the lampshade. And I thought, that's strange. Who would ever do that? And since I've read that sign, I always feel compulsed to put my T-shirt or something on the lampshade. So I guess, it shows you how it is. But I think, basically back in 2005, very often, especially European companies, they would do very short contracts that wouldn't actually explain anything, or just assumed that people had the same understanding. So I remember one case we were acting, it was that the HR manager of a multinational had entered into very large contracts with a consulting company owned by his mother, who was a retired person that had nothing to do with HR. And there was really a big issue that came up was that in the contract, in his employment contract, it didn't say that he could not enter into contracts for the company with relatives. And I guess the Westerners thought, well, that's kind of implied and implicit. And so I think that's what that's what perhaps that issue was, that I find actually the European style contracts work relatively well in China because they're a bit more, detailed about how things work. The problem is a lot of European countries have a statutory type thing, so you can leave a lot out. The worst contracts in my experience are the very long American contracts, which very often I can't understand pages of them. So I think, what I was trying to get to here was back in 2005, you'd often have the engineers, because we were selling B2B, and an engineer would come and he would draft a contract. And I put the picture there of the lawyer designing a car, which doesn't really look that good, or it doesn't even really look like a car, because, engineers can't draft contracts. So I think it's important, even today, it's still important to have a contract which you can actually understand, read, and it contains, all the minimum kind of requirements for a contract.
Yeah, so even nowadays you would still need a lawyer in China, or to take a look at it at least.
Well, a lawyer in China, I think, it's always difficult. I don't like lawyers, and I don't want to try to get them more business. But, I think, you have to admit, I couldn't repair a car. So a lawyer actually at least understands how contracts, or most lawyers at least understand how they fit together. So I would say a lawyer in China, the big issue I have, I've been, stranded in London now for about a year. And, the English, the Americans think that their laws are the best. The English have this confidence that they know that their laws are the best. So, we sometimes have contracts where everything is going to happen in China, be it a school licensing agreement, be it a technology transfer. And the English lawyers insist on having English law and also English enforcement, like say English courts. The problem is most of that stuff is happening within China. So you're going to have to follow Chinese laws, especially in IP. Where do you say that Chinese law stops, English law, begins? And secondly, trying to enforce an English court judgment, possibly it's possible, but I'd say it's almost virtually impossible. So unless the Chinese party has lots of assets in England, you've actually drafted a very long contract, which the Chinese side will probably not understand, which is, actually practically for all the intents and purposes, unenforceable. So I think, when you look at a contract, the most important thing is perhaps the governing law and, the jurisdiction. And hilariously enough, these are often the two last points to be agreed. So people negotiate the whole contract, but they don't negotiate the governing law. And, I think it's improved a bit since 2005. But back then, I came across many Swiss law contracts. And, people had a dispute. And I would look at the contract and it would be Swiss law. And I thought, well, you could imagine, if it was an American company, it's an American law contract. You could imagine someone like Russia or, Malta or Israel, they might use English law because they're used to using English law internationally. But why Swiss law? And, it dawned on me was that people thought Swiss was a neutral country, so it's a neutral law. And I think, with Chinese law, there's no inherent bias in the law. If you look at the PRC contract law, it doesn't say, well, you do this and this, unless you're a foreign party and then you're in trouble. Now, there may be biases against, foreign companies in enforcement or level playing field, but not in the law. And I think, with enforcement, arbitration is the most popular choice. I don't know if it really is the best choice, but it's often difficult to convince people to remove the Chinese courts.
You have to make sure that the contract is enforceable. That would be the start, you would say?
Yeah, that would be a good start. Yeah, I think it's a minimum. Yeah.
Because you mentioned that there are some foreign business people that they would sign contracts with companies that didn't even exist. Is that something that happened a lot? And do you still see that in 2020?
I don't know if I ever saw somebody sign a contract with someone who didn't exist, but for example, there's a number of types of cases like that. The case I remember the best was this Belgian company was selling a very expensive large piece of equipment, and the engineer who's negotiating it, he really didn't like lawyers. So he came to the meeting and he told me, look, I'm only here because my boss said I had to come here and see a lawyer before we signed this. It was like a 50 million euro, but I mean, they didn't have euros back then, contract. And I said, oh, okay. And he said, all I want is an associate to come with me to just dot the I's and cross the T's, because the contract's all ready. And I was a bit surprised because I had read the contract and I could not really understand most of the contract. And then there were the technical appendices, and I really understood none of that stuff. So I was a bit surprised. But anyway, the associate, goes there with him. And this guy had been to China something like 5 times in the last 2 years, negotiating with the Chinese. And the associate phoned me on the second day, and she said, look, there's a few problems. The first problem is the Chinese company is not the Chinese company in the contract. I said, oh, okay, well, I guess you can change that. And then the last thing she said to me was the Chinese company thought they were selling the equipment, not buying it. So I think, you still have a lot of misunderstanding. And I think perhaps even more important than having an enforceable contract is having a contract that everybody understands, so I think that's important.
Yeah. And then what would you advise to write the contract in English and in Chinese, or what would you do?
Well, I think the first thing I'd advise, we just had a few months ago, a UK company had a distribution contract with a Chinese company, and it had English law, English courts. And we did a quick background check of the Chinese company. And, we found that the Chinese company was bankrupt and had been, deregistered 2 years ago. So I think, the first thing before you even draft a contract is find out who you're contracting with. And I'd say it's better to have a good partner than a good contract. So best is to have both, but perhaps the first thing is to really know who your partner is and make sure you're aligned.
Yeah. So how can you do that? How can you make sure that you can share your bet with your partner?
Well, I think Chinese, firstly, you can check easily on databases if the company is registered, who owns it, how big a company it is, what its business scope is. So there's a lot of information you can anonymously pick up easily. But it's also worthwhile. I saw Neil Beatty's on the line today. Someone like Control Risks, they can do a background check and just make sure that you're dealing with a legitimate company. Okay.
And you mentioned arbitration shortly as well. How does that still stand up from back then to now? As you mentioned CITEC in the book as well, is that still relevant nowadays?
Yeah, look, I think CITEC, I think a thing that I've seen is, I would say for certain contracts, so if an English company would do a technology transfer to China, there's a lot of sensible reasons to have at least part of a contract which has got Chinese courts, because it's cheaper, it's more direct, and it can interface with Chinese IP institutions. So it makes a lot of sense, but it's very, very hard to convince people of this. So I think arbitration for any complicated contract, like a joint venture contract, etc., it's the default choice. CITEC, it used to be, I'd say nowadays you still see CITEC a lot, but what we've seen a lot more is things like the Shanghai arbitration and then also Hong Kong arbitration. And I think they've even grown more popular in the last few years, strangely enough, compared to Singapore. So I think a lot of Chinese companies are quite easily willing to have Hong Kong arbitration. So I think arbitration is a popular choice. I'm not really sure if it's a sensible choice.
Why do you think it's maybe not a sensible choice?
Well, like I said, I think, if it would depend on the contract, but if you had a contract that was a technology collaboration agreement in China, it would be more cost effective, more direct to do that fight in China rather than, with arbitration, which is a bit of and the other thing which is arbitration, it's always a bit of a soft type of thing. arbitration normally splits the middle. So you don't normally get a black and white decision. It's normally 80% you were wrong, 20% he was right or something. Whereas I think courts are often, maybe not the Chinese courts so much, but they're often more clear cut. So I think you have to look at it. I mean, when you do a contract, it's going to be slightly different whether it's a private company in Changzhou or a listed company in Shanghai. It's worth spending a few minutes just analyzing who your counterpart is and what's a sensible jurisdiction and what's a sensible law to do it under.
I want to make sure that everyone knows that they're free to ask questions throughout this whole session. We hope to just create a dialogue with everyone, and if there's anything that comes to mind, just throw it in the chat box, and we'll throw it out there. You don't have to wait till the end or anything. I just want to add on top of that, Mark, if you say that arbitration, forget about it, what would be a case that you would still recommend it though?
Well, I mean, I think it would be inherently very unfair to have a joint venture contract under Chinese courts, because the Chinese partner might find out that Chinese court judgments are almost impossible to enforce in Western countries. So, like I said, we still get companies. American companies do it quite a lot, where they will have New York courts, and they seem very upset when you tell them that the Chinese courts are under no obligation to enforce a New York court judgment. China is part of the New York Convention, so they are part of a treaty to enforce foreign arbitration awards. I would say it's not that easy to enforce them, but at least there's a framework to do it. So I think, things like joint ventures and things like that, I think you're going to agree arbitration. So I don't think there's really a choice.
Enforcement in general, do you think within China, compared to 15 years ago, it's much better to get things enforced compared to back then? Or how was it back then?
I think it must be better because you actually see people get things enforced now. Back then, I only ever heard rumors of enforcement. But, I think, there's still a strong case in China where the courts, they're also slightly rewarded to settle cases. So perhaps different from the West, where the judge in China will take an active role and even take the sides apart and discuss with them separately, which is a big no-no in Western jurisdictions. They will try to force a settlement, but they do make decisions. And I think back in 2005, I don't know if it's exactly the right time, but in the old days, back in the early 90s, I remember that very often the judges never studied law. They were often army officers, etc. So I don't know exactly when that would have all came in, but it's become much more professional in the last 20 years. And, especially in first-tier cities, look, I would say it's better. It's for sure better than what people think, but I think it's actually much better than many Western jurisdictions. So we had a case of a large Chinese company that had a very complicated dispute with a distribution company in Italy, with its distributor. And so I've seen a lot of cases like this in China, and I felt that these took a long time to resolve because they would often take 2 years. And that seemed like a long time to me. But anyway, the Chinese, very large company, very correct company, a listed company, they've been battling with the Italian authorities for 8 years. So they had filed the case in the north of Italy, and then after 8 years, the Italian court finally approached the Chinese client, Jerome, and what do you think they asked them?
Enforce it for me.
No, the Chinese company said, the Italian court said, can you refile the documents? We've lost them. So you imagine if this happened to an Italian client, we had an Italian dispute at the same time, or just a few months before. And the Italian guy, he was going crazy at me. Yeah, it was a similar dispute. It was also a distributor. And I said, well, you've got to go to the courts. He goes, we must go to the police. And I said, go to the police? It's like a civil thing. I mean, can you do that in Italy? You go to the police, what they're going to say? They're going to say, is there a body or something? Yeah, what would they say? And anyway, he said, oh, in Italy, in 2 days, this would be solved. And, I never phoned him up, but I wanted to tell him, 2 days, 8 years, and they asked us to refile the documents.
Oh, God.
But anyway.
Well, we've got a few interesting questions coming in. The first one from Doris. Doris is asking, is the CIE tax still preferred choice when going down this route, or are there any other arbitration options now?
Look, I think CIE is kind of famous, but like I mentioned, it used to be, the question used to be in China, do we have, I'm saying back in the late 1990s, 2000s, it would always be like, do we have China arbitration or foreign arbitration? And then if you'd have China arbitration, it almost always was CATAC back in those days. And then I think if you had foreign arbitration, you'd either have Stockholm, you'd have London, you might have Singapore, you might have Hong Kong. And I think now what I've seen is there's still the question. And like I said, back in the old days, I think the Chinese parties were more desperate for the deals normally. So they would normally give in. But nowadays, I think foreign companies are more relaxed about Chinese arbitration. And so I still see CATAC quite often. But to tell you the truth, the last 3 contracts, randomly enough, have all had Shanghai International Arbitration Committee. So there's a few more options in China. But I would say I see much more rarely now European. It still happens occasionally, but I see more Hong Kong. I'd say if I saw anything, it would be Hong Kong International Arbitration Center, and then some Chinese arbitration, and then possibly Singapore. Okay. So, but like I say, it doesn't make a lot of difference, really, unless some litigator can explain it to me. Because, basically, it's just an arbitration body, and they've got rules. And what we do, and look, the biggest problem I see with CATAC and a lot of these arbitrations is that you have these professional arbitrators, and normally in a joint venture you'd have 3 arbitrators, and so the chairman of the arbitrator is kind of the neutral party, and so he's the swing vote. And I've never seen any research, but I think both sides nominate an arbitrator, but that arbitrator, he does seem to be a little bit of their spokesperson or their advocate within the process. And so I think, the chairman of the arbitration, who's more neutral, is very key. And the problem is for places like CATAC, where you have these, arbitrators who do joint venture arbitrations every day in and out, they often just churn it and try to settle. So what we do often is if we agree to say CATAC arbitration, and say it's an Israeli company and a Chinese company, we'll say the chairman cannot be an Israeli national or a Chinese national. And it's not really because we think the Israeli will be biased or the Chinese will be biased, but it's rather just to interrupt, CATAC appointing their standard arbitrators. So then they have to go pick somebody. And our experience has been those people are a bit more engaged. So, yeah. So I think there's no magic on that.
Just a quick one on top of that. Moshrufa asks, if you're a foreign company entering a contract with a Chinese company, would arbitration in Singapore be a better option? Or would you recommend the one CIE Tech?
CIE Tech. Look, like I said, I think it's really the type of contract. I think if it's a supply contract, and if you're just transporting them to China, the chance of them suing you is more remote. So probably you will sue them for non-payment, and suing for non-payment via a China court. Again, if this is a listed Chinese company, I would strongly suggest Chinese court. It'll be direct, it'll be cheaper, it'll be quicker. You'll get injunctive relief. All of that was SIIC, not possible. With HKIAC, they say it's possible, but I've never seen it. But to tell you the truth, I have only been able to convince 1 or 2 people of this. So almost every foreign company will then say, let's do arbitration anyway.
Sure.
And, you know, and whether it's Singapore or Hong Kong, I think Singapore, I don't think it's really a great choice. I think Hong Kong, they at least understand things better. So they're probably a better choice, all things being equal.
I hope that answers the question so far. We've got a few more. Madeline asking if when Chinese contractual partners, are they willing to agree on the Vienna Sales Convention on international sales, or do they often exclude it? What is your experience, Mark?
Well, I think, you know, I think most of them aren't as sophisticated on these kind of issues. So I think, you know, the issue will really be, again, like I talk about the joint ventures, there's also big changes now in the last 10 years. If you're supplying a Chinese company, the Chinese company will, I think, invariably now have its own standard template contract. And this can be dangerous or difficult. So trying to incorporate the Vienna Sales Convention, I think it's going to be impossible. And so I think, you know, especially if it's a state-owned company or they've got a strong procurement team, they will often use contracts. The bigger the company, the more ridiculous the contract can be. So we were working for a German company supplying a large privately owned Chinese car manufacturer. And, you know, we were discussing arbitration before. You know what their arbitration clause is? Their own internal, you know, arbitration committee would decide. And, you know,
great.
they had every freedom. You know, the German company would have to, you know, make sure they had the capacity available. They'd have to provide. The contract was so one-sided that I said, you don't even want to try to negotiate that contract. You just want to perhaps, hopefully, try to rely on the PRC contract law that if there's such an imbalance, that it's just a standard form contract that you could say it didn't really apply. But it's very difficult between companies. So I think, you know, it will depend, but I think it's very difficult nowadays because, you know, normally the buyer sets the rules. It's different if you're buying from a Chinese company, then normally they have to accept your template. But I think invariably now, and of course, if they're not very, very big, you can still do stuff. You can add in certain clauses. But what I found is I add a lot of the legal stuff in the technical annexes because in a Chinese company, the lawyers, who are, like I say, I don't like very much, the lawyers will negotiate it and they often don't know why or what they're negotiating. They just often take opposite positions for no real reason. Yeah. Whereas the annexes are normally negotiated by engineers. And engineers are people that try to find a solution and have a certain level of logic. So I often put a lot of actually what would be legal into the annexes, make sure the annexes are part of the contract, and that can be a good way around that issue.
Yeah, these are some good tips, Mark. Well appreciated, and I hope these answer everyone's questions. We've got another question, someone that works at a big Chinese bank based in London. They say we often lend cross-border into China, but our HO prefers PRC law. Locally, we are an English law qualified, and so we tend towards English law. Which do you think is better in this situation?
So that was a Chinese bank, was it?
A Chinese bank based in London that lends cross-border into China.
So two things: headquarters in China, always right. Rule 2, you know, if they're not right, refer to rule 1. But again, I would actually say the head office is absolutely right. So if you're lending to somebody in China and that's where their assets are, firstly, you know, the Chinese bank will have much better ability to take enforcement action in China than you could from London. And, you know, having onshore ability, you know, injunctive relief, freezing assets, freezing bank accounts. So we have an American invested company at the moment in Shandong province. And, you know, one of the creditors they had has gone into bankruptcy and, debtor, I guess. But anyway, they owed the money to that company. And, you know, that Chinese administrator was able to freeze the bank account. And this has caused us huge problems. If you had arbitration or worse yet, an English court, you know, making a decision, you wouldn't be able to do any of that stuff. So you lose that leverage. And like I say, I think most Chinese court cases end in a settlement, or they get withdrawn. So that ability to take immediate action, it would be very hard to understand why you'd want to have English law, English jurisdiction on that. If it's somebody borrowing money in China and that's where the assets are.
Yeah. I want to remind everyone that we're mainly talking about contracts now, arbitration, but this is just the first episode. We'll dive into a diversity of topics along the way. But I just want to throw in this quick question from Enright. With the ongoing liberalization of foreign direct investment in China, especially in the financial services, are there any new legal developments expected in the area of contract law and arbitration or disputes?
Well, I think they're always ongoing stuff. I think Enright's correct. I'd say if you were going to pick a trend that will be very important for the UK, it is the liberalisation of financial services. And, where we see that the most is in things like asset management, and also there's renewed interest on hedge funds and non-performing loans. I think the law will have to develop. I mean, the contract law is a comprehensive law, but I think we would probably need a lot more specific regulation. And, typically in China, you have a lot of regulations, and then you have draft laws. And, one of the problems for a company in financial services, for example, is if you wait for policy to be black and white law, you will always be 2 or 3 years behind where China is. So, firstly, the regulations are very important because it shows what the regulators are thinking. And the law is very important because it captures what the government is thinking, or the legislature is thinking at that point in time. But, by the time it actually gets approved, then you may be missing out on opportunities if you don't factor in what's been happening in the 2 or 3 years until it goes through the process. Yeah. So I think that there will be new legal developments, but it's not going to be just the black and white published law. It will also be checking what are the regulations, what are other players doing, where are the risks, what are the consequences, and that. And then I think with arbitration disputes, I don't know off the top of my head, but a thing which I did want to mention before, which I forgot, was when we talked about how the courts are developed, China has developed a lot of IP courts. So, Hangzhou's got them, Nanjing's got them. I think Hangzhou also has like cross-border e-commerce type courts as well. So they have set up courts specializing in IP. And I could imagine it may also be happening with financial services. And if it would happen, you'd imagine it would be in Shenzhen as part of the Greater Bay Area. Yeah. And they're doing a lot there with courts. I unfortunately can't remember if financial services was something where they actually would look at foreign laws in the Greater Bay Area, but also Shanghai. So I think for sure they will improve the level of expertise of judges hearing these complicated new cases. So I think Enright's probably right on both of those.
I want to just quickly ask, so you think it's also good to look at draft versions and maybe already adapt before they're actually into practice?
It's hard to say. I mean, it's not normally that easy for companies. So because even the laws, they will say up to the discretion or something at the end. Mm-hmm. So, the laws, even the, especially if we're talking about things like financial services or, foreign, or say VIE models, where people try to get around to circumvent a restriction on foreign investment. So the laws will not be so prescriptive. It's not like a manual how to operate always. So I think, the issue will be to look at what are the gray areas. Obviously there'll be black areas, which, you have to think about. But I think there are gray areas where it's not fully clear and where people may decide to push the envelope. And I think it's important to tell people what the laws are, tell people what the consequences are, but also the market practice. And people have to perhaps make a decision, a commercial decision, because laws also change in the West. It might be a bit different, but I think it's difficult to have especially if you're in something like financial services, which is a dynamic area of the law. if you wait, you may never be successful enough
Yeah.
to actually have a business to worry about, you know.
Yeah. You just very briefly, you mentioned IP, and so John is asking if you're a new company entering the Chinese market and to protect your intellectual property, especially as a software company, where would you start? Just quickly, because we'll cover this topic in another episode. But
Yeah, okay. So I think, you know, firstly, the Chinese IP law, yeah, it's not bad. It's one of the first laws they ever introduced. But I'd say, look, for almost all companies, check your brand, check your Chinese brand, register them. It's very inexpensive. It's about, I don't know, $700 for 10 years protection. So get that done first. Don't let your distributor do it. It's a low cost thing to do. Patents, China's a little bit different from the US. It's more like the German system. So we have, in China, we have invention patents, we have utility model patents, and we have design patents. Design and utility model patents, a lot of them are junk patents. Invention patents are difficult, but definitely if you have something that is worth patenting in another jurisdiction, you should really look at patenting it in China. It's, again, not as inexpensive as trademarks, but I think we're talking about somewhere like $3,000, $5,000 US, and you can piggyback it on the other one. But the problem is, if you don't patent in time, if you miss the grace period, not only can you not patent in China, not only can you not enforce those rights in China, somebody else, you can't even treat your patented technology as a secret because it's already been disclosed everywhere. So really check these things before you go in. And then in software, I mean, software is mostly copyright, but China is a member of the copyright treaty. But the interesting thing is China also does have a copyright registration for software. Many software companies said, I'll never do it. They want my source code and all this. It's not true. Again, it's very inexpensive. You only have to put parts of your code there. And what you get is a beautiful certificate with a big red chop on it. And then if you show it to a Chinese company, they get very scared because it's official looking. And like I mentioned, in China, everybody's scared of the regulators and the officials. So that's worth something. But secondly, if you do have a court case, that is gold as evidence. Instead of proving it's your copyright, you've actually got the Chinese government saying this software was their copyrighted material.
And
so
to bring it back to the courts, to what extent do you think domestic forum shopping is a factor in China?
Well, you know, I think the problem is, it still is. I mean, the last time I had this kind of case, so people think Shanghai is good. I've got a customer in, I don't know, Guangxi province or whatever. Let's agree Shanghai courts. The problem is really with the courts is I've always found has not been the decision. You know, in the last few years, I've had one or two cases where I thought, geez, the court, that was a bit unfair. But really, most of the time, once it was a Dutch company, and the Dutch company got the consulate to write to us and said it's unfair what they did, etc. And so, you know, we talked to the client, and we got the decision of the judge by the Chinese court. And the Dutch company had given us all these documents, or their Chinese team had given us all these documents, and they failed to give us this one document which the judge had based his whole decision on. And so once we got that document, it was very clear that what the judge said made sense. So, so I think, look, the Chinese courts are mostly good. In third-tier cities or fourth-tier cities, it's difficult. But the problem with forum shopping is, if you've got someone in Guangxi province and you have a Shanghai court decision, it's not much easier to enforce in Guangxi province, if that's where their assets is, than a Singapore arbitration award. It's possible, but it's difficult. And it might be part of this, the psyche, because I remember when we were trying, I don't know why I was involved, but I went to this third-tier city trying to enforce a Shanghai judgment. And, the judge was a bit upset, even though he's an enforcement judge. China, we have a filing judge, the hearing judge, and the enforcement judge. And the enforcement judge said, well, why do you come here with your Shanghai judgment? Why weren't we good enough? Why didn't you come to, Guangxi province to, hear the case? So I think forum shopping is difficult. Yeah. Depends again on who your counterpart is.
One more question from Doris. what do you think the direction of travel of law developments in China in, let's say, 5 years time frame? Which direction it will go?
Well, the direction of travel, I mean, I'm hoping I can travel there without quarantine or something. But I think, look, the law, I think it will follow this idea of liberalization. I think, yeah, as China gets, you know, if you look at the hot sectors or the sectors they have to reform, I think financial services, like Enright mentioned, that's something they have to do for themselves, you know. And, you know, also the financial markets with this star market in Shanghai that's getting a lot of stuff in. I think they would still realize they're lagging behind, you know, the West in governance and all these kind of things. So I think it will continue to get more sophisticated. I think they will continue to welcome foreign investment. I think, you know, another area, which is, I think, a hot area, things like mobility and their connection to smart cities. And one of the issues there is that, you know, smart cars, smart cities and autonomous cars, they often center around, you know, GPS or tracking and, you know, that kind of, you know, data. And that's extremely tightly held in China. So that will be something that probably won't change. So I think, you know, in sectors where they feel they have to import ideas and improve things, you know, even semiconductor stuff, they'd love to get more people in, they will. But those core sensitive areas like media, like, you know, national boundaries, tracking, mapping, I think these things, it's not going to open up very quickly. But I guess the other trend will be, and it's another chapter of the book about joint ventures where I was quite negative. I actually think now there'll be more and more joint ventures. And I think, you know, because those laws won't change, a lot of foreign companies will have to team up with Chinese companies. But it's a bit different because these joint ventures are not centered on manufacturing. They're really centered on the Chinese market.
We'll
and
see
it
a
may
lot
well
about
be.
that in the second episode. In
Oh,
2
okay.
weeks' time.
Sorry.
We don't want to give away too much yet.
Oh, spoiler alert. Thank you for that.
Yeah, it's a real cliffhanger for everyone else.
Yeah,
I'm
very
sorry
well
to
done.
disappoint you, Jack. You have a great question. We'll save it for the next episode because I have a burning question that I wanted to ask Mark before I let you go. Is that what were the first Chinese words that you learned when you came to China?
I would say, I know that the one you want me to say is guanxi, but it's really not. The one, it's a word which is used even less than guanxi. It's mayo. And, you know, when I was back there in 93.
Mayo Chan.
Yeah, mayo every bloody thing. So, you know, back in the early 90s, you would have all those foreign students wearing T-shirts with just mayo, mayo, mayo. And, you know, I think that shows you how far China's come. I don't even remember someone saying mayo, except for like mayo Wenti or something. I don't remember for years, but for the first 5 years, that was the word you would hear, whatever you do. If you go to a bakery and you want to buy some bread, be mayo, mayowanla. And you know, they say, come back, you know, not tomorrow, come back next week. You know, you go to a coffee shop, there was like one coffee shop, and they got upset if you ordered a coffee. It was like, no, we don't have it. So I'd say that was the first word I would learn. And you don't hear it that much anymore.
Yeah. And you don't drink beer, so you must have learned the word wine in Chinese.
Yeah, but actually back in those days, I did drink beer back then because it was cheaper than mineral water, and you'd get these things called reeb, which I don't know if is really true, but reeb is beer spelt backwards. So I don't really know if that's the truth, why that came up with that name. But reeb was the beer in Shanghai, and it was a bit dangerous to drink it because every fourth bottle you'd pick up would explode in your hands. So ni hao, I agree. Yeah, so guanxi is a word that you learn a lot about. Yes.
Yeah, in a lot of seminars, and people always talk big about guanxi, but is it really much different than just having good relationships in Europe or anywhere else for that matter?
Well, I've changed my views on this a bit. I think Well, I think, firstly, I think guanxi is important. And I think I would have probably written in the book, which I don't have with me, but I think I would have written something like, it's a universal human trait. I mean, like guanxi is important in Europe, it's important in America, it's important in Australia. And I think I still agree with that to a degree, but I think over time I've realized guanxi is like real guanxi is a bit different in China, because I think Chinese people do have deeper interpersonal relationships. And I learned that because I had some health problems last year, and I landed in the hospital in China for a week, and everybody in the office visited me. They bought me a Christmas tree. It was Christmas, so it wasn't too weird. They bought me radio, flowers, fruit. And then I was in hospital here in the UK for a month, and nobody except for somebody Chinese from the office visited me. So I think, Chinese people, they do have, they stress relationships more than Westerners. But I think what I would say in the book is people that talk about guanxi, it's a bit like, sex appeal. I don't think Brad Pitt talks about his sex appeal. No. And so people who talk about guanxi, no, people who have guanxi, they don't really talk about it. And I think, the other thing is when people talked about guanxi back in those days, and I think they talk about it less now, it was always about doing a shortcut. It was a guanxi that was kind of a bit crooked. And I think, you have to earn that kind of guanxi, because that kind of guanxi that they were talking about, it could get transferred, it could go to jail. It wasn't really real. And, one other thing I just quickly say about foreigners overestimate their guanxi all the time. And I met this Swiss professor who was traveling, maybe it was 10 years ago or even longer. And he had done a trip, and I had lived in China, I think, for 15 years at that time. And, he asked me about guanxi, and I kind of said what I said just now. And he said, well, do you have a lot of guanxi? And I said, no, I don't really have guanxi. I said, look, I know a few people that might know somebody, but, I don't really have any guanxi, because, it's a bit like Santa Claus.
I would say the same if I had a lot of guanxi.
Yeah, no, but like if you had Santa Claus, for me, guanxi was back in those days a bit like Santa Claus. If you really believed in it, it existed. But as soon as you really tried to rely on it, it just disappeared. And he said it's very interesting because the foreigners that he had talked to in China, the longer they were there, the less they believed they had guanxi. But he met a Danish guy in Suzhou, and he'd been there for like 1 year, and he had guanxi coming out everywhere. He was able to organize everything. And so I think, guanxi, it's a complicated thing. Yeah. Still important, but people don't talk about it as much as they used to, at least in my experience.
Yeah. Well, I want to, first of all, thank you for kicking this series off. I hope it was all okay with you, and that we can continue.
Oh, it was fun. Well, thanks for doing it.
Sure. Yeah, of course. So we already picked a date for the second episode, and in the second episode we'll dive in more deep about structuring your business in China, JVs, WOFIs, you name it, and the new foreign investment law. We're gonna dive into that. And
super boring topic, very boring topic. Yeah, but at least thanks for giving me more notice, because for this one you gave me 4 days notice. So yeah, this is a bit better. Yeah.
And thanks to everyone for joining us and asking a lot of questions. It's great. Keep it up, and we hope to see you during the next episode. Yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone, and thank you, Mark. And have a great weekend here from Shanghai.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks everybody.